Go ahead and get started. This is Operationalizing Security Controls with me, Tony Ucida Velez. Just a little bit about myself before we dive into the meat of the presentation is that the main thing is that I've been really focusing on application security because I've started a company that focuses on that on multiple different levels, from governance to actually testing to fixing. I also wrote a book with a co-author of mine, Marco Morana, from Italy, on a risk-centric threat modeling approach. And one different take that we're going to see today is around how threat modeling can actually help you shift left and build a blueprint for knowing what types of tools, techniques, and types of tests or tasks do you want to automate in your pipeline. I've also run the Atlanta Open Web Application Security Project for the past 10 years. Here in Atlanta, it's a very healthy chapter. And, so that's a little bit about me. Now let's dive into the good stuff. So there is a lot of talk, obviously, on, DevSecOps. And, what's basically touted is this basically utopia of, technologists coming together to say, hey, they're almost ushering in this silver bullet, if you will, where automation is going to, save time, save money. We're not going to, have so many dependencies on having security testing, post-mortem to deployment, post-mortem to building. We're going to curtail our open risk issues in our applications, in our web environments, in our cloud infrastructures. And oftentimes what, really happens is that you have, kind of a messy situation, let's just call that. And so what we have is, because of poor execution, because of poor understanding, because of competing priorities in organizations, you have, a lot of things that actually could make things worse, such as orphan technologies that get deployed because, there's a lot of initiatives to do DevSecOps, but it gets orphaned. Sometimes you might have repositories or containers or different types of things that extend your attack surface from a security standpoint. You might have technology that becomes unmaintained, which that in and of itself can become a security nightmare. So you begin to lose time, money, and credibility as you're trying to share this message of, DevSecOps, of shifting left for automation. So let's take a step back and try to think, what are we really trying to solve with, DevSecOps operations? And, there's a full list of things that are really beneficial. One of my, things that I always like to introduce myself, having been in the IT/IS industry for over 20 years, is that, this is a super exciting time with DevOps. And understanding security can provide a way where you can take repetitive efforts and begin to create automation, be able to leverage information analytics so that you can reduce, obviously the security gaps, reduce time. I haven't met a developer or, engineer that loves to interface with auditors, that loves to be able to get a remediation task list on things to do. So when you can reduce time for doing manual configurations or remediation of those configurations or code bases, then, you're looking like a hero. There's also opportunities, by the way, from a assurance level. And what we mean by security assurance is that if you're part of a company that basically sells a product, whether it be an appliance that has embedded, code, or has software that's packaged up and sent or downloaded, you obviously, part of the reputation of that software is assurance that there's security built in. So it's important that, security, building security into the code base, into the infrastructure, into the actors that run different processes in your environment is all very important. Also, from a compliance standpoint, there's a lot of interest in operationalizing security or operationalizing governance, as I have there in the last point. The idea with this is that, oftentimes compliance and security governance are basically Mars, and, DevOps is, a completely another planet, right? And so what we want to do is we want to be able to understand what does the different regulations and laws that we have for security in the cloud, on-prem, related to privacy. Let's let's extract the security requirements from these frameworks, from these control sets, from these laws, that basically require some level of hardening, some level of assurance that security is built in. And there's multiple ways that you can do that by working with your team members in compliance and governance to be able to say, what are you looking for in this part of the ISO 27001 framework, or the NIST 853 framework, or a COVID framework? Insert framework du jour. You guys get the point. And we're actually going to go through some examples later on in the presentation. Now, planning the shift, beyond just simply, a whiteboard approach, is being able to establish some clear goals. Okay, and so there's a lot of phenomenal talks here. You have to think about what are your goals specific to encompassing security activities within your DevOps role. Is it more secure source code? Is it greater assurance for open source libraries that are included in your product? Is it assurance on the configuration of your platforms? Is it basically taking some of the incidents or security events that you have and funneling it into your overall infrastructure so that you can mitigate against those events? So you have to define what those goals are, and you have to think about how they apply to not just prod, but also your lower environments like dev and QA and stage and UAT, et cetera. You want to be able to ensure that you have consistency in your controls across these environments, and so that you don't just introduce automation that is let's say has test cases that are 10 to 20 in prod, and in UAT and dev it might be 30. So you might actually be underscoping some of the controls that you need to be automated. Shifting left really is this idea that I'm not going to think about security after I deploy something and then do pen testing and then do source code review. It's about being able to do those types of security activities quicker, faster, and integrated into the software development lifecycle. You'll see this word operationalize a lot, and I just referenced it earlier in the last slide, where you can actually operationalize governance and compliance controls by basically codifying a lot of the configuration standards into code that's part of your CI/CD pipeline. And I think that is the future. I mean, that's as a, the company and the clients that we work with, we are seeing that they are actually pushing for this because of lack of resources, lack of time. Everyone needs to be able to have that assurance that security checks are being performed. Now, looking at kind of like the topography of, what we're dealing with as technologists when we're doing, some level of, DevOps work, or even, on-prem work, if we're systems engineers or developers or DBAs, there's a lot of technology at stake. And so, part of the plan, going back to the topic of this section of the presentation, is really, you have to define, what is your scope, right? What is your scope that you want to provide assurance for? And, it might be, define your goals in terms of what do you want that to be? You want it to be where if you realize that you have a strong dependency on third-party libraries, and that in your traditional vulnerability management, you're seeing a lot of vulnerabilities with that, then you can basically take those same types of vulnerability checks and preemptively look and see what sort of dependencies you have on those third-party libraries, and ensure that they're running in the most secure release of that particular package, that particular binary, so that you have that assurance built in. And you don't have to do that post-deployment once someone's already hitting your infrastructure. From a governance and compliance standpoint, there is numerous amounts of arguments to support this as a goal that you should bake in. Take a lot of the controls that you've defined. When I say controls, it can mean from a framework, like I mentioned some earlier on, where it's like ISO 27001 or COVID, or you can take it from different regulations. In the United States, we have the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and there's different technical safeguards that healthcare providers need to abide by. Well, let's look at those. Let's see how what requirements are there for for access control, what requirements are there for different security tenets and principles, and let's see if we can configure our systems at an earlier stage prior to deployment so we have that assurance and we don't have to focus as much on remediation. From an agile security testing, the model that we're seeing is that, testing faster, but in smaller scopes. Oftentimes a traditional pen test or application pen test, going back, 5 years would be, a web application, the web APIs, authenticated measures, but it would be a broader scope. When you're doing agile security testing, you as a development team, let's say you're doing client-side development or you're doing, service-side development, you might have specific use cases that you're working on within your team that change. And there needs to be a determinant in terms of when do I need incremental security testing? What are those conditions? For example, has my authentication model changed? Has my, did I introduce, a new role in my RBAC model? What about my data type? Am I now using a different data type that is actually a little bit more severe in importance or sensitive that really requires me to take care of it in transit at rest? These are types of conditions that you don't have to do a full application, scan on that as you're basically building those use cases. And just like you would do functional unit use case testing, you want to do, security abuse case testing to see what abuses are actually successful against those specific features that you're adding per your incremental builds. The nature of DevOps landscape, encompasses, obviously managing code, building environments, managing our images, our repos, integrating them into different environments, configuring, deploying, and then, overall just maintenance of the environment. So just, taking a look at a standard SDLC, defining, designing, develop, deploy, maintain. We want to be able to, you want to be able to think, where do I want to focus my efforts? Do I want to focus my efforts on the quality of my code base? There's been a lot of examples today on integrating, linting or static analysis in, for example, code management. So there's an example where traditionally, going back again, even now today, you have a lot of companies that are like, please review my code base that's already in production. And so when you do static analysis or linting, you have security people that are finding things, or the security products that are finding things. And you have, literally a book of things to find as you've already deployed to production. So it's already an after the fact, matter. What we're basically soliciting here is as you check in your code, certain types of static analysis checks are done against your code base for different types of security, poor security measures, things, everything from poor parameterization, poor sanitization of input, implicit trust between class objects, the list goes on and on. So the point of looking at this landscape is you got to pick, where do I want to start, right? Create a maturity model for yourself. And this is all in the theme of this section of planning the right DevSecOps strategy. Now, here's just an exemplary pipeline. When we're talking about automation, a lot of the automation centers around instructional tasks that systems or applications or tools today are going to be reading in order to say, okay, what do you want me to do as I build or as I deploy? And so here we have an example, and a lot of this stuff is typically in a type of YAML file or XML based file, where it's structured file where it defines what are the tasks that I need to focus on as I build different things. So if I kind of zoom in here, we kind of see this particular file where we have the opportunity, and we're going to reference a couple of different open source tools where you can define, well, I want to leverage a particular type of static analysis tool against, this code base, or I want to be able to, run a particular tool for dynamic analysis. Like in this one example here, as you want to be able to run a different type of dynamic application security tool against a external API. And typically what's done is that you can take a lot of these kind of concatenated tools together, whether it be dynamic analysis, static analysis, or configuration gap analysis, environment analysis. And you can basically define the tool to be used and also the parameters for which it should be used against the target. And then you have a repository of the results. And then you can even develop logic in terms of going through those results to see what are you really looking to extract. If you run any of these types of tools individually, like let's take an open source tool like the Z attack proxy from OWASP. And if you run it just, in a traditional sense against a web target, as a human, you would have to read and parse the information. If you have experience in looking at these types of tools and you see a repetitive occurrence of accuracy on one particular item, that's a great candidate for automation, right? Obviously you want to be able to get those true positive findings and be able to, that's a great candidate for you want to take that dynamic analysis check, or maybe run the full set of checks and filter for one type of result so that you can, do the remediation automatically. I mentioned, a couple of OWASP tools. There's a great tool called OWASP Glue that, and OWASP is phenomenal because it invites collaboration of a global community, and there's always a need for contributors, but the OWASP Glue project allows for a configuration file to be defined so that you can define the security tasks in order to validate, fix, test your code base or your application or your infrastructure. Now, here's this twist on planning is, what about threat modeling? And many of you may or may not know what threat modeling is. In 2015, me and my colleague, we wrote a risk-centric threat modeling book called Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis. And we'll cover a little bit about how this kind of flows into the whole picture of shifting left. Because many talks that you'll see really talk about, certain types of activities that are common, like dynamic analysis, like static analysis. But, even if we weren't talking about, from an automation or a DevOps perspective, if you were to just run those types of tools alone, you're left with a lot of results. So what do you fix? And that criteria of what do you fix can be baked into a threat model. So the idea behind a threat model is, especially a risk-centric one, is that you look at your full stack and let's integrate threat intelligence in terms of your application. So let's say, for example, there is a financial application that is really used by international brokers on multiple different, financial exchanges. And it has obviously, a high dependency on continuity and availability for the service. So inherently, your threat model should have a threat of, I care about continuity. What are the types of vulnerabilities at the application stack, at the application level, at the code base level, if I originated the code, at the infrastructure level, where I can basically mitigate downtime? And, that is one threat, the threat of downtime, the threat of DDoS, attack, because maybe there's a threat adversary that's trying to bring down your application. You want to be able to use threat modeling to define a blueprint of what you want to automate, okay? And so part of that might actually encompass things like compliance. For example, you might be in a heavily, there might be a requirement for you. Let's say that right now privacy is really hot, right? We have GDPR affecting multiple different, countries worldwide who are managing European data. In California, we have, CCPA. We have this idea of pseudonymization or encryption to be able to obfuscate personal information, personal data, right? What if you would be able to, as constant assurance, because how many times do we see that there's a breach du jour where there's an there's a S3 bucket that's basically, unencrypted, or something in our infrastructure that's unencrypted, or Maria database that's exposed to the internet. I mean, there's a lot of these cases. To provide the assurance that if we do manage this type of data, that it is encrypted, it is, there is pseudonymization applied, there is some level of obfuscation applied to it, then that is actually a goal, right? Because we have a threat That might not be an adversarial threat from a likely, from a nation state or something like that, but it is a threat of noncompliance as well. So you want to be able to think like, what are the things that affect the application that is in scope, the system, the infrastructure that is in scope, and what sort of checks can you do to provide assurance and make those checks occur on a certain cadence. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, basically the threat modeling methodology of process for attack simulation and threat analysis has 7 stages, and I've defined them here with underlying activities. And so there's also a RACI model for who should be involved and from what different groups. But, a lot of the things I've already mentioned factored into a good way of thinking, how do I want to have a DevSecOps strategy for automation? So I've already mentioned the regulatory aspects. If you want to take all your regulatory checks, let's say that you've been audited for the past 5 years. You look at your prior audit results and you see audit controls where you have been faltering. One audit control that, just from experience is always an Achilles heel for many organizations is logging. They log network logs, they don't log so much at the application stack. So to be able to ensure that logging is done or logging is basically up to date, just simply writing a check that gets basically instrumented into, a task that's part of a, CI/CD pipeline where it says, am I logging, yes or no? What is the evidence of this log? And let me take a snapshot of this and put it into a audit or a compliance repository. What we've seen the effectiveness of this is that when those organizations get audited, and because a lot of these tools like SharePoint and Confluence already support APIs, you can take evidence and then you can basically do a post of that evidence into a folder that has the control domain of logging, so that it basically shows a time period of weeks or months, time and time again, where logging is effectively done at the app stack, at the system stack, at the infrastructure stack. And so when auditors come knocking on the door again, it's like, okay, first help yourself to here and let us know the delta. It is night and day in terms of time. And this factors into the idea of, building security in terms of control requirements, which is what the example I put here, in understanding the business objectives.
Hey, Tony, I just want to let you know that this is your 5-minute warning.
Oh, okay. We're going to move along here quickly. I'm going to go through some examples. There's more on Pasta that you can get from the downloaded slides, but let me get to some good example here for automation. So let's talk about operationalizing governance, mapping automation opportunities into SLC. So here's a real criteria. 12.3, use of cryptographic controls to protect your information. Basically, there's network requirements on how that's applied, system requirements, database requirements, application security requirements. So there's multiple ways that you need to demonstrate how to comply with this. There's a great the HashiCorp Vault in conjunction with the Terraform scripts with HashiCorp can allow you to dynamically create, implement, and archive evidence that you've implemented crypto, the latest crypto, to all your environments, with and fulfill this control set. As an example, you can make this happen by using SaltStack, StackStorm, Chef Puppet, Ansible, you name it. But the actual command line that you can use to basically check all these different environments, and if it's not there, implement it dynamically, is there and capable. So this would fulfill, as an example, 12.3 ISO control set. Another one is, let's talk about endpoint protection. So, oftentimes in an audit, the question is, how are you protecting endpoints? Your endpoints collect, a lot of information and emails and downloads, et cetera, source code. And so, one question is, what are you doing about endpoint protection? You can even take a PowerShell command and basically through Azure, a lot of the Azure interfaces that you can do, you can have all your endpoints as they're authenticating to the Azure cloud, or an AD resource in the cloud, Azure AD, then that check could automatically be done on a certain cadence to make sure that FDE is actually applied. And again, you validate the control implementation and then you archive it for evidence. There's multiple other different examples. Here's an example where we're basically, taking, OWASP glue, and you can notice here on the right, we have basically, different types of security tasks. Here's a linting task for doing, static analysis. You might have different, here's a dynamic task for, running dynamic analysis against an API endpoint. There's gauntlet, there's check marks. And so the idea here is defining certain tasks that you want and what the outcomes are. And then further on, you can actually parse those outcomes if for specific items that you're looking for, like, for example, share secrets stored in files, as an example. Moving forward, overall, some practical advice is that, there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of platforms, and, crawl, walk, run is a great model for you to basically say, let me start small. Let me start with just configuration management. Let me start with just like 5 controls that I want to automate. Start small, grow from there, start within your lower environments, migrate to your prod environments. You're going to find that you're going to have increased, and try to leverage some of the tools that you already have that support things like, JSON and different types of API requests.